Our 50th anniversary summer at Sorrento Centre. And this is a reunion week for former staff, and all of the courses and the worship leaders and the music leaders are all former staff from various decades of the history of Sorrento Centre, and I'm thrilled that you're all here. And lots of members of the community have also joined us for this evening. So our special guest is Jim Cruickshank, the first director of Sorrento Centre. And we thought that maybe the best way to do this would be just to interview Jim about the early days. So it's partly about the center, it's partly about you. So it's spontaneous, and we're going to take questions from the rabble at the end. So you can be prepared. So I'm interested to know, when was the first time you actually heard the word Sorrento Centre?
I was on vacation going to Banff for something, and I'd heard about it and stopped in because a friend of mine was working there. He became the dean of Daza Kootenai and Greenhall. Jack and Jill Greenhall. And I stopped in, and they were the students here, and they having a summer vacation Bible school. But they had just bought the place, and they were keeping the grounds and cleaning out Nova V, a space pond, which was in pretty tough shape when they bought it, as far as, you know, needing to be cleaned up and things. And I just stopped in to say hi to them, and that was my first time I'd ever been here.
So I just want to make a statement for the record that the video camera we're using tonight has been loaned to us by Jack Greenhall's son, Mark.
I'm Mark. That's amazing.
So that's probably 1963.
Yes, or 63, yes.
63 or 64.
63 or 64, yeah.
Okay. And so...
I think 64, actually.
64. So when were you hired?
I was hired in the fall of, or interviewed in the fall of 64, and then hired in the January, February of 65. And of course, you get 3 months notice, and I started on the 1st of May in 1965.
And you were just a kid?
Yeah, I was just a kid, 27 years old.
27 years old.
But I became 28 in June.
And you were a priest.
Yes.
And you just finished your first pastorate, right?
Yes, I was in McBride, the Upper Fraser Mission it was called. It's called Robinson Valley Shared Ministry now, but it was 250 miles of logging camps between Prince George and Jasper. And that was my first parish. And 70 miles of gravel road, and the rest we did by railway.
So at 27 years old, what did you think you were getting into?
I had no clue. The difficulty was no one else did either. And because I thought I was going to be leaving McBride to go become the new vicar of Ashcroft. That was what I thought was happening. But in those days, you didn't do what you thought was happening. You did what bishops told you. And Bishop Coleman and Bishop Dean had a conversation, and I was going to Sorrento.
So two bishops ganged up on you, and that was the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
All right.
The story's a bit more dramatic than that.
So what buildings were here when you arrived?
The thing that stood out the most, of course, was the huge barn that was up there next to the farmhouse. You understand that this was kind of the typical estate where there'd be a little gatehouse, then there'd be a farm where you provide where the Clydesdale horses would be. But next to the house was this incredible stable, and that's where the riding horses and the carriage horses would be for the estate. And then the wash house, the old became the wash house, was the home of the gardeners who had looked after the magnificent gardens around. And then there were, what do you call those little brown things? You know,
A gazebo.
A gazebo, I can't get that word. There was a beautiful gazebo that was kind of on there. And there was an old chicken house and other little outhouse type buildings that were all part of the farm and the orchard. So there was a combination of 3 sets of buildings. The farm, the ones that provided the servants for the kinghorns, and then buildings around to deal with the orchard. And so that's kind of, the trees were in terrible shape, and the place the grass had all grown up. The place was in pretty bad shape, actually.
So where did you live?
Well, I lived in what's now the Xerox room. And there's only one phone in the place, so that meant that it was my bedroom at night and my office in the daytime. And so if the one phone rang, I had to go upstairs and get where the phone was for, fold my bed up, go sit in the stairs while we did the phone call. I loved it. It was great. I mean, it's better than the vestry I did in my first parish. People forget that in those days in Anglican church, if you were single, you got the parishes and the rectories that married people wouldn't go to. So I was quite used to living in house trailers and vestries, and so I was quite posh. I had a fireplace each time. So I liked it.
And did everybody live in Spesdona?
Yes, it's all, yes. Well, except Les and Nancy. When I came here, I brought 2 people with me, and there was a theological student who was assigned here for the summer. So the first staff, I arrived in May, and I hope you'll ask me a little bit about Ray Bray, because he'd done a lot of preparation type stuff before I came here. But the first, I brought Les and Nancy. I just yesterday visited Les's grave. Les and Nancy were parishioners of mine at Christ Church Valemont. And Les was a millwright on a mill, and millwrights can fix anything with haywire, because he was a millwright during the Depression, so you can understand. And Nancy was a mill cook. And of course, the best cook got the best people in the mill. And Nancy never wasted anything. So I brought these 2 Depression survivors to be the cook and the maintenance person and a theological student. And then we added to that, I think I can get their names, Kathy, Julie, and my sister Pat, and Brian and Warren. Was it Warren or was it Brian? I think that's what, they were the 5 teenagers who were on their first summer staff.
And the theological student, was that Jack?
That's Jim McNaught.
Jim McNaught.
He was a fellow student in Emmanuel College.
So you asked me to, so I'm going to ask you about a number of different people. So you asked me to ask you about Ray Bray.
Well, Ray Bray was the priest of this parish, which included Solista, Chase, and Sorrento. And he was a young priest who had huge amount of experience in the Dawson Camp, the Diocese of Toronto. I've forgotten the name of that.
Aurora or
somebody Cruickshank or something.
Cruickshank.
Yeah. And he knew a lot about camping. I mean, so he was the rector of the parish, but also kind of priest in charge of the centre on behalf of the Diocese of Kootenay that had the most shares in it at that time as the province was trying to sort out what was going to go where. And he was just an amazing guy. He had so much energy. He was the one that bought all the bunk beds and the mattresses and the first plates and all that stuff. So when I arrived here, the bunks were already here, brand new, and the new cutlery and all that kind of stuff. But of course, no dishwashers, things like that. We used to draw names out of a hat to see what we should.
So I read in an early memoir, a memoir about the early days of Sorrento, that there was an imagination at some early stage that the director would also be the rector of the parish in Chase.
Yes.
And therefore would live in the rectory or
Yes.
vicarage or whatever in Chase.
There was a wonderful priest who, I wish I can't get his name to come. He was one of the first people to do the meetings with rural parishes.
Yeah.
And I wish I could get him. He's just such a fine priest. And he was very interested in this place. Then he realized that he couldn't do his work out in the field and run a parish and look after this place at the same time. And he said he really thought if the place was going to flourish, it needed to have a person who gave all of their attention to the center. And that's the background to that. But that was one of the early ideas.
One of the other people I wanted to ask you about was Derek Arnold.
Well, so Derek Arnold is one of my heroes. Can I just speak a bit longer about Derek? Derek Arnold was an Englishman who was an administrator for the Diocese of Kootenay. Bishop Coleman, the Bishop of Kootenay, was somewhat like myself, not very good at managing paper and details, okay? So he needed an administrator, and Derek was a man who didn't need to work, but he knew the diocese needed a good administrator, and Derek was a good administrator, so he volunteered for $1 a year to work for the Diocese of Kootenay. He was also the secretary of the board and doing all the negotiation between Kootenay and this place to finally get it established. Who does it belong to, the province, and all that kind of thing. But Derek was very much against my appointment, as was half the board, because I was too young, and I was, you know. And so Derek was against my appointment. But then after I was appointed, no one supported me more in my first year than Derek Arnold, because he had that statesmanship that makes our church sail. When you vote and you don't get it your way, you still support the majority. And Derek was disappointed that such a young person got this job, a dream of a lay training center, but yet he just supported me more than almost anyone else. And until Ted Scott came along, of course, everything changed then a lot too. But he's the one who gave us all the land, the property line and the original acreage. It was the road, we called that the new road, because in all my first years, the road was once over here, was into your place.
Yeah.
But the far side of that road was the property line. And Derek Arnold bought, when he saw the place was beginning to grow after the first few summers, and of course we were being cabanas on that property, didn't really belong to us, and baseball games going on. Derek bought down all the land from the property line over and including the schoolyard. And then one day when we were out there talking, and we're talking about fire stuff and all that kind of stuff and how we were going to deal with that. And Derek said, "Have you got $1 in your pocket?" And I said, "$1, sure." He said, "Well, if you give it to me and write yourself, if you give it to the center and write yourself a receipt, and then give it to me, I'll give you a receipt, and all of this property will belong to the Sorrento Centre." And that's how we got all the property up to the alignment of the schoolyard. We also made an agreement at the same time that the center could use the schoolyard anytime they want to during the summer. I don't really know that.
I didn't know that, but I follow the spirit of that.
So you can see that Derek, he did the books. I did the daily journals every night before I went to bed. And once a month I go down to Kelowna where my mother lived, and so I could visit my mother, leave the stuff at Derek's place in the morning, and then go the evening and pick up the monthly statement and bring it back. And Derek did that for once a month for the whole, for half the time that I was director, and the other half. Oh dear, I can't get Ted Scott's wife for Isabel Scott did our books for us. I did the same thing with Isabel. So I pick up the books. The only difference was that Isabel and I would solve all the church problems. I picked up the lid.
There's a story about two different prices being offered for the Sorrento property. The church bought the property for $37,000, yes. But there's earlier correspondence offering the property for $49,000.
Yes, and it's really too bad. We had a very hard time raising the $37,000. But if we had the $39,000, we also would have owned the motel and all of the beach. Right? The beach would have been double the size it is now. And of course, as you know, the beach is now worth $102,000 a foot or something like that. But it's too bad. The 37 was a very big stretch for us, and it's just kind of tragic. Almost we couldn't have got that extra $10,000. Oh, we got little stories like that.
You mentioned Bishop Coleman.
Yes.
What can you tell me about Bishop Coleman?
Well, Bishop Coleman was the principal of Huron College. And principal, even a principal of the theological college, better be careful I say. Sometimes they don't like having bishops and people in the church tell them what to do all the time.
Yeah, we'd much rather tell the bishops what to do.
So anyway, when Bishop Coleman was very much in favor of this place, and when Graham Tucker came to make the proposal to him and tell him what the idea, Bishop Coleman immediately became supportive. But when the Constitution was developed, he didn't have the director tied down by too many stipulations and regulations. So I was kind of given, there's a good side and a bad side to this, of course, kind of a blank check. I think the first Constitution said the purpose of the Board of Directors is to support the director in, of course, his work, is all the jury said. But that was my mandate. And the board was to support me in that mandate.
Are there any board members? The
Bishop Coleman, and it was too bad, he resigned soon after, but he was very supportive. But then, of course, it was Ted Scott who took his place, and Ted did, I could go on forever about what Ted did for this place. But Bishop Coleman really believed in the place, and after he was the chairman of the board, where Byrne Barrett was for a year, and Byrne Barrett was the person who wanted me to be here, and was on the board, and introduced me to Bishop Coleman. And after that conversation, Bishop Coleman phoned Bishop Bean, and Bishop Bean phoned me, and I came here.
You mentioned Graham Tucker's name.
Yes. Graham Tucker was an engineer who became a priest, and he had a strong commitment to the interface of church and world, and how the church wasn't doing enough to kind of engage people who were in the world making decisions, and how theology should shape our decision making. And so he, being an engineer, got a map of Western Canada and drew a line between Edmonton and Vancouver and Calgary and Prince George. And they crossed here. So he took his summer holidays and he came out and he visited around, and he saw the land down there where the Kawi fathers had a little priory, and noticed that that land belonged to the Diocese of Kootenay. Then he came by here and saw a for sale sign on what was called the Kinghorn Estate. It was owned by somebody who had bought it from the Kinghorns and had a stable or riding thing here, but they couldn't make it go. And he thought, my goodness, that property with that space bone and the center would make an ideal place for a lay training center. So then he goes down to Kelowna, talks to Bishop Coleman. Bishop Coleman gets excited. Maybe there could be some deal made between them. And I think you've read some of the more recent correspondence on that. The details that I'm fuzzy on, but I think maybe you could say something more about the details about that property and this property.
Just to say it, I was surprised I saw you seeing pictures of the little house, and it was thought not suitable for a retreat center. It was a bit of a dump, actually.
Yeah.
And what I didn't know was that the house was not as significant as the fact that it came with 6 acres around it,
Yeah.
which is a lot of land just across the creek, and a house on the lake.
And that Grant House.
Yeah, the Grant House. So it actually, when it was sold, I think produced something like $25,000.
Yeah. And that went to help the down payment, plus $10,000, I believe it was, from the National Church.
Right.
And that made the down payment.
Right. So you mentioned Ted Scott.
Well, when Ted became bishop, he was very, very interested in this place. And he, in fact, I mentioned how the Xerox room was where I lived. And of course the hall, the little cupboard across the hall. Ted Scott always kept a pair of coveralls in my cupboard. So when he came up here, he would take off, and his clericals on, he'd take off his clerical and put on a pair of coveralls. For example, the first cabana was cabana number 2, and it was built for $125. And Les and Ted Scott and I built that cabana. It didn't last very long. But anyway, it was, Ted loved the place, loved to work here, led a lot of the courses. And the most important thing, I've never been very good at raising money, and that's pretty important if you're going to make an institution go. And so a lot of the early money that came to the place to help it get developed was raised by Ted Scott and the people contacts that he knew when he was in other situations. And so The place would never have made it financially if Ted hadn't had the ability to ask people to support something. But he really believed in the place. And so without any apology, he would go to people, and we had a Johnson family, a McLean family, and they gave money regularly each year to the place. And without that, we could never have survived. Because the fees in those days were $1 a night, $1 a meal, $15 for a course, and $3.50 for a cabana, and $2 for a campsite. And the staff were all volunteers, and we all got small honorariums. And so, without Ted and his just passion for lay education and his and the ability to raise money, that was a very important part of the place. I always get a bit embarrassed when people talk about my work here, because it couldn't have happened without Ray Bray, Ted Scott, and most of all, Ruth Hall, who will be coming here on Thursday. And Ruth Hall was brought here by Ted Scott because she and her friend Ian Hives, who later worked they worked together in the Indian Friendship Centre in Toronto. And Ruth was a deaconess, and before that had been a secretary to the president of the International Harvesters. Ruth could type 60 words a minute and carry on a conversation. 90 words a minute, carry on a conversation at the same time. But Ruth was the person who looked after the details and all that. And so they are, in my view, the people who really, Ted, Ruth, Ray, are very important to the beginning of this place. Plus, a huge number of other people that I can go on for a long time. But I just say those weeks, I want to be sure they're not mixed out.
Sure. And one of the people who is associated with the early history, who stayed connected all these years, was Marilyn Fain.
Absolutely. And Marilyn came here for at least 2 courses a year, thanks to the Diocese of Westminster. When all the campsites were built, the ones on this side, the ones around your house were the first campsites. But Marilyn was, looked after all the youth, drove the tractor when those campsites were being done. I was able to mention this at her funeral. She and Joan took many courses here over the years. But her courses, many people who have very responsible jobs now look back on the courses that Marilyn led on group work, and so working and making decisions in group, management of conflict. All those courses were taught by Marilyn Fain for, I would think, most of the time, I would say all the time that I was here. This center owes a great deal of appreciation to Marilyn Fain.
And from the beginning, the centers had intensive summer programming.
Yes.
Where we made good use of the beach.
Yes.
But one of the things that people talk to me a lot about is the winter program.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about the winter program?
Sure. When they were interviewing me, and remember, I didn't want the job, so I said, when that happens, you don't mind, you just sort of threw things off. So anyway, the summer program is understood. It would be a place where adults would get an education to enrich their, what we call baptismal ministry, the life in the world, and their children and youth would be looked after while the adults took the course. That was all very clear. That was set. That was what it was going to be about. But what do you do with the winter and fall? And so when they asked me, I don't remember, I'm 27, this was the 60s, what would I want to do? Have a house on the edge of a lake with a bunch of smart young people and hang out and get going at something. So I described the winter course off the top of my head. And Bishop Coleman said that was what got me the job, I think, because Bishop was, here's the person who has an idea about how the place ought to be used. And so, and I wanted to be a teacher anyway, and so here was a chance to do what I always wanted to do. And that was the beginning of the winter course. And so then I discovered that the United Church had been having something similar to what I described all along. So I went down there and hit it off with Ivan Cummings. We've remained friends until he died, actually. And
You're talking about Naramata Centre.
yes, and so Naramata and Sorrento advertised all our programs together. We moved it to 4 months so we could have the fall and they had the winter. We taught in each other's programs, advertised each other's summer and winter programs. Never had the same program here that they were having there at the same week, and worked very cooperatively with the United Church all during that time. So I have to say that I redesigned the off the top of my head thing when I learned some things from 18 years of experience on Naramata at that time.
So you designed the program off the top of your head. You announced it in the middle of the job interview.
Yeah.
And you were very surprised that you got the green light for it.
Yeah.
And you attracted some really interesting students.
Well, then from the 1st of May until October, I was able to recruit 18 people. Now, 2 of them were here today, and of course, Edith is here. Her daughter Marilyn was the very first person to register for the winter course, and to marry Dave from Prince George, who I knew, was the second person to register for the winter course. They ended up married to each other. And then today, Ron and Wayne were here. There were 2 members of the winter program, but there were 18 people I'd met. And I had a contact with a lot of them because Edith and I were chaplains for the AYPA, it was called then. And so I gave talks to young people everywhere. So I knew a lot of young people from British Columbia because as provincial chaplain. And every time there was a provincial conference, I would talk about Sorrento and the winter program. The word gap year hadn't been invented yet, but I've always resented the fact that I didn't take a break between my BA and my master's degree. And I went to my bishop and said I wanted to take a break. He said, "Oh no, the Lord needs you now." Well, I think the Lord would like me to have taken a gap year and grown up a little bit. So I've always had this thing that people should take a break and take a year to kind of get away a bit, travel, something like the winter program. So it was kind of something that came out of my own experience, and I wished I had not gone to 12 years of high school and 7 years of university all in a row. There should have been a year to step back. And so the winter course was about stepping back, learning some leadership skills, learning how to worship and live together, how to deal with people who are different than you. How to be, well, as Lance Richardson would put it, and we'll talk about Lance too, I imagine. Lance will always say that how do you be a person for others, a man for others? And that was the kind of dream behind it all.
So you said that in the beginning everybody lived in Spasbona. I've heard a story, you tell me if this is true, that when the winter students were coming, maybe it was the 2nd or 3rd year, that Malcolm Hunter was being driven up by his parents.
That's for summer. He came for the summer.
He came for the summer.
He wasn't part of the winter program. He was a lifeguard for 2 summers.
But you were housing him in Skunkhollow.
That's right.
Which was this broken down log cabin. So is this a true story?
Yes, it is. Malcolm is, as you know, is a supporter of this place, but he was a very popular lifeguard for 2 years. Now, there's a bit of selfishness. I love water skiing, and I owned a boat that I probably couldn't afford. But anyway, that was another story. I always made sure there was a lifeguard who also could drive a boat. So that I could water ski every day before I got so good at it, I could just look at the list of how many people there were, because I hate lineups, and it's tough to line up for food in those days. And so I used to kind of say, oh, there's so many people here, I can water ski until 5:15. And then the lifeguard would get the last ski. So anyway, that's another story. Malcolm arrived with his family from a very established family. He went to a very fine private school. And coming to Sorrento, well, the place I described, as you can tell, and where the male staff stayed was a little log cabin that was collapsed and was falling down. And of course, there were 4 bunk beds in there for the male staff. And when Mrs. Hunter saw that where the boys were going to meet him, he arrived with his slippers and his kimono. And I showed the accommodation and Mrs. Hunter wanted to take him back immediately. And I became very good friends with the Hunters, and they're gone now, but they wouldn't mind me telling the story at all. And I'll never forget to say to his wife, I can't remember her first name right now, but she said, it would be good for him. Let him have rough it free. Well, Malcolm had one of the best years at summers of his life and came back the next summer. And he was he just had character and was set the tone for the summer staff for 1966 and 67. They're just really were a wonderful staff. I'm glad you asked me about it.
When I think about staff housing, sometimes I think not much has changed. Lance Richardson.
Well, Lance is an absolute top personally. Lance was the person who dragged me off to church. My church experience was kind of limited. I got expelled from Sunday school when I was 10, so I didn't last very long in church. But Lance was a scoutmaster and 4-H club and all the stuff I grew up with in Surrey. And then when I moved to Prince George, Lance came to visit and got a job up there, because that's where all young men went to get jobs. It was up north. And he dragged me to church one Sunday, and I just said, I only own jeans, I couldn't go to church. And he said, well, I'll give you a little bit. So I went to church, and Tom Allen was the rector, and he said, Bert, we're starting confirmation next Sunday. Do you want to go? And I said, oh yeah. And I said, you're going to go to confirmation? I said, oh no, I didn't want to. He looked like a penguin standing there with his black thing on. So I said, you make promises, you got to keep them. And that was the beginning of it all for me. So I was baptized, and the rest is history. But Lance,
so when you came here,
Lance came to the winter course.
You came to the winter course.
Yes, and to come to the winter course, it meant that Lance had to leave his job, which was in charge of all the parts for all the Department of Highways, for all of British Columbia, and all the lines on all the highways and all the equipment that did it, and left that job to take the winter course. After the winter course was over, of course, he couldn't go back to the same job, so he got a job under the job he had before in Williams Lake. And went back, and then, of course, Les had died, and we were all heartbroken. All the winter course students just loved Les and Nancy. And so I phoned Lance and said, we're talking. Lance came to visit, and I said, I don't know what we're going to do, because you'll never find a guy to replace Les, because he could fix anything. I mean, the tractor, the old truck were always breaking down, and let's fix them, you know. And so Lance said, I think I could do that, because we've got a farm. His father could fix anything, you know. And so Lance could too. So Lance quit his job and came here and worked $200 a month. He built this building, and
so
the sewer system out here, this lasted for almost, how long is that? Since 1968.
So my understanding is he first of all built the Panabode cottage, isn't that right?
Yes.
And that Farmer Dave now lives in.
Yeah.
That you subsequently lived in. And then
Bishop John Snowden was on the board and was one kind of behind that.
And then the next summer, you organized the youth staff to build what was then Nova Vita. Is that right?
It wasn't the youth staff. It was there was a number of people. We used to have a program for called I can't remember the name of it. It was kind of Travel Canada, the Travel Canada program, and we used to have Travel Canada students stay here on behalf of the government to give them shelter, because everybody was hitchhiking in the 60s. And two of those guys, Claire and Jeremy, they worked on it. A fellow who was here for rehabilitation because of, not a long story, named John Kirby worked here, and a few other people that worked with Lance during that time, and plus anybody who was coming through would volunteer. But every single row of logs were inspected by Lance, and the next row couldn't go on until the first one was inspected, and the next one couldn't go on. So Lance watched every single log in this building was inspected by Lance before the next one could go on. But it wasn't. And then we had such wonderful support from the local community. When I think of the early days here, I think of of Horace Dobson, for example, who the first time I met Horace, we bummed a bunch of rather terrible plumbing. We did everything on the cheap. And so we had this awful plumbing. And Coral West was trying to make the old garden house, the first wash house, into a wash house. And then, of course, we got into trouble and needed help, so we needed professionals. So Horace came down, he's a local lumber, and he comes, and he couldn't believe that we're going to make a wash house out of all this junk. And so he helped us restore all of that. And then there was, of course, Clarence, who put all the gravel on the road, and then there was Rudy at the gas station who would come and help us fix the tractor and the truck. So we had this wonderful relationship with Shell, the guy who built a lot of the buildings around. So we were just these local men that just they just came. And when I wrote the checks and stuff to pay them, I always I knew that they were not charging us what they were worth. They gave a huge amount and never asked for a receipt or anything. They just always did more than they got paid for because they couldn't figure the place out sometimes, but they believed in it.
You said it was the 60s, and so therefore we did this and therefore we did that.
Yeah.
I remember the 60s as a time of struggle with authority.
Yes. When everybody was evading in principal's offices, the students all came to me and invaded my office and said, if you keep on using that prayer book, we're all going to leave. I'm 27 years old. This is the next year. 28. Yeah. So I phoned my bishop, Ted Scott, because remember you have to do your service as the bishop's second. Most of us used to wear cassock and service and knelt on the hardwood floor, you know. And so I said, what are we going to do? And Ted Scott's so wise. Gosh. He said, Jim, there's not many places in Canada where young people are going. But you seem to be able to get around 20 every year to go to Sorrento. He said, negotiate with them. He said, when you negotiate, there's always got to be some boundaries. And what you do, bishops, you blame the bishop. That's what you're supposed to do when you set boundaries. So here's what the bishop said, okay? Here are the boundaries. Only a priest can do the consecration prayer. If there is an absolution, only a priest can give it. And other than that, they can pretty well design their own services. However, they must write the psalm. And there must be at least one Bible reading. Other readings they could choose. Well, of course, that took a huge amount of work. You could do the service together. And I would give anything if I kept those psalms. Because the psalms they wrote are like the psalm book. You know how songs are psalms of lament and psalms of praise. And at the beginning of the year, after they got their way, and the bishop supported them, and I was kind of cheesed off a little bit, actually. and so, well, they did me out of a job. I was celebrating and preaching and stuff. But they had to do their own. But anyway, if I kept those psalms, they all began with laments. Laments about their parents, laments about society. Because the 60s were a time of young laments. And all those laments appeared in the psalm. But as their lives were transformed and as they moved into community and they began to celebrate, and the psalms all became songs of praise. And I think if we kept those psalms, we'd have a record of the 60s and the center that would be better than this conversation or anything ever written. Would be the journey of the psalms that the students wrote themselves.
Now, was your relationship with the diocese as generous and as cooperative as your relationship with Ted Scott?
No, it was mixed. Now, the director of the Sorrento Centre, if he or she is a priest, has to be licensed in the diocese where the centre is, which is Kootenai. So I was on leave of absence in the Diocese of Caribou. All but 10 years of my 50 years of ministry have been associated with the Diocese of Caribou. So I was a priest of the Diocese of Caribou, licensed by the Bishop of Kootenai. Okay? So that was the kind of relationship with Kootenai. But our relationship was with the Ecclesiastical Province of British Columbia and the Dioceses of Edmonton and Calgary. And that relationship was very mixed. Several of the bishops in those areas thought that maybe I was not the right person and my theology was a bit too humanistic, and there was difficulties around. Because in those days, the church used to fund the place. They don't do it much anymore, but in those days, the place belonged to the church, and in each of those dioceses gave a grant each year, and that was very important. That's why we could have courses so cheaply, is because the diocese was supporting them.
So just between you and me, can you say a little bit more about that conflict with the conservative bishops?
Yes. In fact, I can, because there's reconciliation also happens. In fact, the stories are quite personal and quite moving, actually. One of the bishops was the Bishop of British Columbia, and he was very concerned. He and his wife came up here, and I think the worship service was pretty wild that day. And I can understand, because I would have been a bit concerned too when I was younger, and when I first started him. And so anyway, he suggested that the Diocese of British Columbia cease its grant. But a young priest named Barry Jinks fought for Sorrento. And a few years later, the grant came back when Barry became the bishop. The other bishop was Bishop Goodman in the Diocese of Calgary. And Bishop Goodman wanted the place, he changed the name to the Sorrento Centre for Human Development, which was a mistake. But I really wanted to find a way of engaging the world more. And the World Sorrento Centre for Sorrento Lay Training Centre. You know, I mean, I was on a ferry one time. I had a blue T-shirt with SLTC, and someone said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means Sorrento Lay Training Centre." He said, "For goodness sake, there's some things you don't need training for." So the next year, it said Sorrento Centre already. Where was I? Of course, and he wanted to change the Sorrento Centre for Godly Studies or something. And he and I kind of debated back and forth. And then he came here after he retired to meet the world, and came here and celebrate communion often, outside, not wearing all the robe, and really fell in love with the place. And Bishop Goodman and I became very, very good friends. And so, and I can't get the name of the bishop in British Columbia, but he and I also became very good friends. I remember him having barbecued a wonderful steak dinner for me one time. So both the people who were bishops who were really against what we were doing ended up being very, very great supporters.
Sorrento Centre fits into larger movements in the worldwide church.
Yes.
So there, after the Second World War, there was a European movement for lay education.
That's right.
So this was a response to a sense that the church was too driven by clergy.
Yeah.
Right.
And not engaging the world enough.
So there are some other centers, or there were some other centers then at the time that were kind of models.
Yeah.
Nowadays, a lot of people talk about Iona,
Yeah.
but in your day, you talked about
Yeah.
Lee Abbey.
Well, no, in 1966, it was made possible by the Maple Leaf Society, which is an English company that helps Canadian church, for me to visit all the lay training centers in England, Scotland, and go to a Kirchentag in Germany. And so I spent 6 weeks visiting. So Lee Abbey was the great-granddaddy of them all, where it was like a very, very large Sorrento. And they had a program where people would go for the summer.
This is the biggest state in Devon, right?
Devonshire. And then the other one was Scargill.
Right.
And we had an exchange with Scargill, where people from our staff would go to Scargill, and Scargill staff would come here.
Scargill's in Yorkshire.
That's right. And then in Dunblane in Scotland. And then, but the one that I liked the most was Worlow Grange in Sheffield. It was really fun for me to go to Sheffield because that's where my grandfather came from. But Worrell Grange was different. There was a man named Bishop Hunter who was an industrial chaplain who became a bishop. And he had this concept of how do you engage the decision makers in different professions by bringing them together to discuss the decisions they make and how those decisions shape their jobs. And of course, you're an ethicist, of course, and so you know more than I do that underneath all of that is theology. When you start talking about ethics, eventually you get to theology. And so there would be, had these courses at Worrell Grange, which was an old house where these where pharmacists would come, or mechanics would come, and those kind of things, and people, professions. And that's what I began to do here. I followed Worrell Grange more than anything else. So when we had courses for probation officers and courses for policemen and all those kind of courses in the spring and fall, that was based on what I learned at Worrell Grange. And then I went to William Temple College in Rugby, and that was where I went to courses called the Urge to Violence, where the police officers, clergy, and another group of people were together, and the best stuff happened in the pub. My regret always it wasn't we couldn't have a pub here.
I'm with you. So
Best things happen in pubs.
So before we open the floor to questions, I just have a few personal questions for you. In the 19th century, there was a kind of parlor game, and there were a set of questions that people were asked. It became famous as the Proust questionnaire, because Marcel Proust answered this twice in his young life, and then wrote about it, and it's become popular in various sources. So I've got a little adapted list which I'll select from. So what's your favorite word?
My favorite word?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Transformation.
What's your least favorite word?
I'm not going to say it publicly. I live in the West End, I hear it every other word.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I would much rather have been a teacher than a priest.
What profession would you not like to do?
Work on a gravel crusher, throwing clay off so you could crush the rocks into gravel. I did it for one summer and I was killed.
What historical figure do you most identify with?
Who have I identified? What I most respect is Cranmer.
Cranmer. What living person do you most admire?
Living person. Isn't it funny? A flash of a number of people who have died in the last 10 years have just gone through my head. But I guess of living people, I would think probably Peter Elliott.
What is your most treasured possession?
Unfortunately, just disappeared. A little green jade grizzly bear, which means shusha in the Anglican language. It was given to me at the healing gathering after I offered my apology to the nation for the simulation and abuse that took place in St. George's residential school. And if my house was to catch on fire, I think that would be the first thing that was, unfortunately it has disappeared. I don't know what happened. But that was my most, then I would also say the pictures of my grandchildren and my children.
What is your greatest fear?
That I would someday have to face my pride.
When and where were you the happiest?
Here, and I would think my happiest years were probably here and in Chicago.
What's your greatest extravagance?
Oh, always my car. Always my car is way beyond my means. Because I spent most of my life, when I was a bishop, people would say, "Where do you live?" And I said, "In my car."
What's your favorite journey?
Oh, the first time that I left home to go up Stewart Lake, Tashi River, Trumper Lake, Little River, up to Tackler. The first time that I went as a young kid to be a hunting and fishing guide. And every year going back to the same, repeating that journey every year in June. That was my favorite journey.
What do you consider your greatest achievement?
I think helping develop a curriculum in a theological college that changed it from an strictly academic institution to a school where theology practice, personal growth, and spirituality were all joined together. I think that to move, to change the curriculum of a theological college and be a very important part of that was probably the thing that I would be my most biggest accomplishment.
What do you value most in your friends?
Truth and trust. I have friends who trust me, and I think trust is what I value most.
What is your motto for your life? The words you live by or that mean a lot to you?
Okay. What truth do I want to be during my one life on this earth?
What would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Thanks for doing your best.
Questions?
Wow.
Questions? Yes, Marks.
You began to hint on the change going into the 70s and wrestling with a change of name.
Yeah.
And I think most of us who've had an association here look on that decade, the one of the 5 decades of this place, as being the decade we know least about.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand that decade?
Yeah. Well, yes, and of course it was pre my going off to Chicago and getting another larger vision of things and more kind of theology undergirding. And I was desperate to try to find some way in which this center could be more appealing to non-church people as well as church people. Because I think the church is, how I've often said is like this is Hans Kungers, need 3 conversions: to Christ, the church, and the world. And we just were not engaging enough, and I wanted to find a common word. And so the word human is pretty common. And so I thought that how we develop ourselves as individuals and as society is what God's dream is. That God's dream be a world where there's peace with justice, and you can't have that without sacrifice. And we bring that together, have a theology, but I couldn't quite get the theology together enough or explain it enough to understand why I wanted to do that. One time you and I were talking, Chris, about church and world stuff, and I talked about bridge, but you talked about a drawbridge, which is a lot better, it seemed to me. It was all around that kind of, say again when you told me about drawbridge.
Yeah, I was saying, we were talking about Sorrento being a bridge between the religious and the secular. And I said it ought to be, but we have to understand that it's a drawbridge. And it can only be raised or lowered from the inside.
Yeah, and it was that attempt, and of trying to find a way of just being more open and engaging and welcoming to people who didn't understand all the jargon of institution and church, and it probably the church didn't understand what I was doing, and I was attempting by changing the name changing to the Sorrento Centre for Human Development, but the church didn't understand, and I couldn't explain it, and others couldn't, and so they didn't have to be changed back. So is that the kind of thing we're talking about? It was that wrestling with. We've gone through the secular city, church, and world stuff, but something else was needed now to do that thing, and I was wrestling to do it and help that, but couldn't quite make it.
Another question? There's another question over here. Okay, under those circumstances, it's just almost exactly 8:30. So there's a snack in the dining hall and worship at 8:45, hold in prayer in Cocoon. And thanks, Jim, this was amazing.